Patrick Hicks Music Stories presents Every Grammys Ever, the 13th Annual Grammy Awards, March 16th, 1971.
The eyes and ears of the music world turn to the people who make music. They gather in Hollywood to bestow upon their fellow artists their highest honor, the Grammy Awards.
We're into the next decade now, and things are starting off on a good note. The Grammys are finally live. From here on out, there's no more Best on Record specials airing months after the award ceremonies. Now we all get to find out at the same time what mistakes the Recording Academy have made. Actually, honestly, tonight is not so bad. So since the Grammys are now live, the awards are taking place for the first time ever in only one location. This time it's Los Angeles at the Hollywood Palladium, and the host is the singer Andy Williams in his first of several hosting gigs. Now, other than being live, we saw some other historic firsts on the night. First of all, we finally see a nomination for Jimi Hendrix. Jimi had died in September 1970, so he didn't get a nomination in his lifetime. And even tonight, the only nomination he gets is for Best Contemporary Instrumental Performance. But he is nominated for his iconic rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. I mean, is there a more important instrumental of the decade? Obviously, he is going to win. No, he lost. And you're never going to believe who he lost to: Henry Mancini, for the album Theme from Z and Other Film Music. Henry Mancini. Through the course of making this series, he has become my arch nemesis. And that was it. That was all Jimi got. And I think his 0-for-1 record at the Grammys is pretty shameful. One very important figure, although not a musical one, who did get a win at the 13th Annual Grammys: Martin Luther King. He won a posthumous Best Spoken Word Grammy for Why I Opposed the War in Vietnam. And it's a good thing that he won because he'd already lost twice in this category before, including for the I Had a Dream speech, which lost to the poet Rod McEwen. Okay, the depressing stuff is out of the way. Now let's talk about the big awards. Best New Artist tonight goes to the Carpenters, who beat out the Partridge Family and Elton John. The Carpenters had a big night. They received 5 nominations, which is tied with Simon and Garfunkel for the most nominations on the night, including a nomination in all 4 big categories. And kind of strangely, the nominations in both the Song of the Year and Record of the Year categories were exactly the same, except there was a different Carpenters song nominated in each category. For Record of the Year, it was They Long to Be Close to You, and for Song of the Year, it was We've Only Just Begun. But the other 4 nominees in both categories were exactly the same, and they were James Taylor's Fire and Rain, Everything is Beautiful by the country singer Ray Stevens, Let It Be by the Beatles, and Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel. And Bridge Over Troubled Water wins the Grammy in both categories.
I'm sailing right behind like a bridge over troubled water.
Now, the Beatles, who just lost their last chance to win Song or Record of the Year, they did receive 1 Grammy that night. It was for Best Original Score written for a motion picture or television special for Let It Be. The award was given to them by, of all people, John Wayne,
John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, or Let It Be.
and Paul McCartney actually showed up to receive the award, which was a big surprise, and it was a big get for the first live Grammys.
Thank you. Good night.
And now for the nominees for Album of the Year. The Carpenters are nominated for their album Close to You, and their fellow Best New Artist nominee Elton John is nominated for Elton John. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young get another nomination for Deja Vu. The band Chicago is nominated for Chicago. James Taylor is nominated for his album Sweet Baby James. And Simon and Garfunkel get their second Album of the Year nomination for Bridge Over Troubled Water. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums that came out in 1970 that were not nominated. First of all, you've got the first 2 Black Sabbath records, Black Sabbath and Paranoid, which I get they were not going to nominate. I mean, these weren't even critically successful, let alone that commercially successful. But for the next couple decades, we're going to be tracking the disrespect of heavy metal at the Grammys, so let's start here. And if there's any genre more disrespected by the Grammys than heavy metal, it's punk rock, so let's talk about the Stooges. The Godfathers of Punk released their second album, Funhouse, in 1970. Then we've got Cosmo's Factory by Creedence Clearwater Revival, This is Creedence's 5th album, and they are still nominationless at the Grammys. They never win one in their short but important career. And this was a really successful album. It spent 9 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard charts. It had 6 hit singles, and they were all top 5 singles. It sold millions of copies. It's kind of inexplicable that this is not recognized for anything. Miles Davis's masterpiece, Bitches Brew, Santana's Abraxas, Curtis Mayfield's Curtis, and the Grateful Dead, who we haven't actually talked about on the channel yet, although I did use a picture of them when they were the Warlocks, but they put out 2 records, both American Beauty and Working Man's Dead this year. If there ever was a year that they were going to get a Grammy nomination, you would think it might be 1970, but they don't. In fact, they have 0 wins and 0 nominations for their entire career. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to Bridge Over Troubled Water. Simon & Garfunkel really owned this night in a historic way. They became the first group to win Song of the Year, Record of the Year, and Album of the Year on the same night. They were the first group to win 5 Grammys in a single night, a record that has been tied a couple times but only beaten once. And, separate from Simon & Garfunkel, Paul Simon did even better. Since he was the songwriter of Bridge Over Troubled Water and Garfunkel wasn't, he picked up 2 extra Grammys, the Song of the Year Award and a Best Arrangement Award, and his 7 Grammys were a record that held for over a decade and is still the 3rd most in a single night of all time. This is an absolute classic album. I think it's safe to say that the first live Grammys and the first Grammys awarding music of the 1970s is a success. Now, let's see how long they can stay in this groove. Episode 15, the 14th Annual Grammy Awards, March 14th, 1972. This is the Grammys covering the year 1971, and 1971 is hands down my favorite year in music ever. It's a year so good there's a whole documentary just about this one year. And I think what's so cool about it is that you have all these different new genres that start coming into their own. Heavy metal, glam rock, progressive rock, funk, and then you have some of the greatest albums ever all in one year. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, Led Zeppelin 4, The Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers, The Who's Who's Next, Joni Mitchell's Blue, David Bowie's unappreciated at the time masterpiece Hunky Dory, Sly and the Family Stones' There's a Riot Going On, Funkadelic's Maggot Brain, T-Rex's Electric Warrior, John Lennon's Imagine, Elton John's Madman Across the Water, and the list just goes on and on and on, and not a single one of those albums was nominated for a Grammy. Not a single one. Sometimes we see with awards shows that it just becomes somebody's year, and that's what happened this year. This was the Carole King year. Carole King was a very successful songwriter who somehow had never been nominated for anything before, but who struck gold with her 1971 album Tapestry. It became one of those albums that everyone just had to have in their collection. So it's hard to be too mad at these Grammys, but still, just rewind this 30 seconds and listen to that list of 1971 albums again. Not a single one is nominated. It's okay. I love Carole King. Carole took home both the Song of the Year and Record of the Year award with different songs. Song of the Year, she won with the song You've Got a Friend, a song that was also covered by James Taylor, and she becomes the first ever woman to win in this category.
You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running.
And then with the song It's Too Late, she wins Record of the Year.
And it's too late, baby, now it's too late. Though we really did try to make it.
She also becomes the first woman to win Song and Record of the Year. She's going to beat a lot of records tonight. I don't know if I can name them all. Best New Artist that year was Carly Simon, who beat out Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Bill Withers. Now here are the nominees for Album of the Year. We've got the Carpenters back again with their self-titled album Carpenters. We get our first Beatles solo record nominated, George Harrison for All Things Must Pass. We have the soundtrack to Jesus Christ Superstar. We have Isaac Hayes' album Shaft. And then, of course, Tapestry by Carole King. I've already talked about what came out this year that wasn't nominated. There's not a lot of suspense here. This is the Carole King year. She wins Album of the Year for Tapestry. So just like the year before when Simon & Garfunkel won Song of the Year, Record of the Year, and Album of the Year, Carole King now becomes the second artist to pull that off. And an interesting note on this win is that Carole King was not actually there in person to accept it. The awards this year took place in New York. Carole King lived in California, and she had just had a baby, so she opted to stay home with her newborn instead of attending the awards. But when she won for Record of the Year, which had been her third win that night, Herb Alpert, who was presenting, said, well, she had triplets. The 15th Annual Grammy Awards, March 3rd, 1973. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about this year's Grammys. It's hosted again by Andy Williams. He hosted last year too. This is his third year in a row hosting, and it won't be his last. Another interesting thing is that this Grammys was telecast live from the Tennessee Theater in Nashville. Now, Nashville had been one of those cities that had hosted a Grammy Awards, but this is the last time that a Grammy Awards is going to be hosted outside of LA or New York until the 64th Annual Grammys, which were held in Las Vegas. And finally, this is the first Grammy Awards to be shown on CBS, which would become the Grammys' permanent home for every year after this. And this is another pretty good year. One great thing right off the bat is that the comedian George Carlin wins his first Grammy for Best Comedy Album. The Best New Artist category is especially stacked this year. You've got Harry Chapin, John Prine, Loggins and Messina, and the Eagles. But the winner is the band America of Horse with No Name fame, and I think that's only the second time I've ever named all 5 Best New Artist nominees, because usually there's at least a couple you've never heard of, but this was a good category. Now, Song of the Year and Record of the Year tonight go to the same song, and it's a very unlikely hit, The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face, which was performed by Roberta Flack. Now, this was an old folk song written by the legendary British folk singer Ewan MacColl, the father of Kirsty MacColl, the guy that wrote Dirty Old Town, but Roberta had recorded a version of his song for her 1969 album First Take. Now, the song and that album didn't make much of an impact at the time, but it had one very influential fan, and that was Clint Eastwood. Clint really wanted to use this Roberta Flack version of The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face for a movie that he was making, his directorial debut, Play Misty for Me. And its use in the movie made the song a huge hit. It was the biggest single of the entire year, 1972, according to Billboard, and it made Roberta Flack a star. We'll definitely be hearing more from her in a future episode, but she beat out songs like Don McLean's American Pie, Harry Nilsson's Without You, and Gilbert O'Sullivan's Alone Again Naturally, which people my age might know better as the song that he sued Biz Markie for sampling.
The first time ever I saw your face, I thought the sun rose in your eyes.
And I love this win for Roberta Flack, but I do feel like this kind of negates the Grammys' whole credo of we don't care about charts and album sales. This song came out in 1969. Why was it not the best song of 1969? Why did it becoming a big hit suddenly make it the best song of the year? This is still one of my problems with the Grammys today, is that they sit around waiting for artists to submit the work to them, and then they will go and listen to it and decide if it's worthy of winning anything. This should be your job. You should be going out to find the best songs. Even if a song is not a hit, the Recording Academy should know that this song is the best song of the year. I know that's not how it works, but that's how I think it should work. Now I'm off my soapbox, let's talk about albums of the year. Okay, the nominees for Album of the Year are the soundtrack for Jesus Christ Superstar. And no, you're not getting Deja Vu. Yes, that album was nominated for Best Album of the Year last year, but that was the London recording, and this is the original Broadway cast recording. If you want even more Deja Vu, George Harrison is nominated again for an album that does contain some of the same songs that were on All Things Must Pass, which was nominated last year. But this is a live album. This is the Concert for Bangladesh, George Harrison and Friends. George gets another Album of the Year nomination, and weirdly enough, since Bob Dylan is on this album, he was part of the Concert for Bangladesh, this is technically Bob Dylan's first Album of the Year nomination. We also see Harry Nilsson's classic Nilsson Schmilsson, which came out in 1971 but is nominated here. Man, I'm just getting through all my Grammy gripes in this one year. You've also got Don McLean's album American Pie, and finally the album Moods by Neil Diamond. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums that were not nominated, and man, 1972 is almost as good as 1971. Some of these are so painful for me. So you've got David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. It's David Bowie's breakthrough album. this not being nominated for anything is a travesty. You've also got the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, which a lot of people consider to be their best album, not nominated for anything. Got Neil Young's Harvest, Yes is Close to the Edge, Miles Davis is On the Corner. And then you've got a bunch of great records that were a little more obscure but still should be mentioned here. Nick Drake's Pink Moon, Deep Purple's Machine Head. You've got some important German bands that were ignored, Can and New. The first Roxy Music album, and then one that of course was not on the Grammys radar, but it's just one of my personal favorite records of all time, Big Star's #1 record. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to...
Oh boy, here we go, the concert for Bangladesh.
The Concert for Bangladesh, another year where the Grammys made the right choice. George gets some redemption after All Things Must Pass lost last year. Bob Dylan finally technically gets his first Grammy win. George becomes the first ex-Beatle to win an Album of the Year Grammy, although he will not be the last. And again, so far in the 70s, I'm pretty happy. There's so much great music in the 70s that of course a lot of stuff is going to get left out, but I think this is a great album and this is a great choice. It might be the best mood I've ever been in for this series. We'll see if it lasts. The 16th Annual Grammy Awards, March 2nd, 1974. We are back in Los Angeles this year. Andy Williams is hosting again, but the important thing about tonight is that the Stevie Wonder era of the Grammys has begun. Stevie Wonder is the most nominated artist this year with 7 nominations from both 1973's Intervisions and 1972's Talking Book. The eligibility year for the Grammys in the 70s is real wonky. It usually goes from October to October. So this year it was October 16th, 1972 to October 15th, 1973. I will talk about this more as the years go on, but I absolutely hate this. If we're talking about the album of the year, it should go by the calendar year. There is no other source that is measuring what's the best album of the year that doesn't just use the calendar year. So if I'm going to Rolling Stone to find out what were the best albums of 1973, they're not going to put Talking Book in there just because it came out in October. I'll save the rest of my ranting for future years where this is a bigger problem. But we see a song from Talking Book nominated for Song of the Year and Record of the Year. Also in both categories you have the Carly Simon classic You're So Vain. But the winner in both categories for the second year in a row is Roberta Flack for her song Killing Me Softly with His Song.
I'm in my bed with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song.
By the way, have you ever wondered whose song was Killing Softly, the singer of the song Killing Me Softly with His Song? It turns out it was, of all people, Don McLean of American Pie fame, who Roberta Flack had beaten at the Grammys the year before. The original version of this song was written by this young songwriter named Lori Lieberman, who was inspired by seeing Don McLean sing. And then the song gets kind of taken over by her managers, the more experienced songwriters Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox, and they take all the credit. They're the ones that actually accept the Song of the Year Grammy. Speaking of Record of the Year, one of the songs nominated in that category is Bad Bad Leroy Brown by Jim Croce, who had tragically passed away in 1973. He gets another nomination that night for Bad Bad Leroy Brown in the category Best Pop Vocal Performance Male, which he loses to Stevie Wonder, but when Stevie Wonder accepts, he dedicates the award to Jim. Jim ends up never winning a Grammy, but some artists that do win their first Grammys tonight are Neil Diamond, who wins his first and only Grammy in the category Album of Best Original Score Written for a Motion Picture or Television Special for Jonathan Livingston Seagull. He had had a couple nominations before and would have a total of 13, but only this one win. And Gladys Knight and the Pips, who also had some previous nominations, they win 2 tonight. One for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus for Neither One of Us Wants to Be the First to Say Goodbye, and Best R&B Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus for Midnight Train to Georgia. Also getting their first nominations, by default, are the Best New Artist nominees. You have artists like Barry White and Marie Osmond, but the winner ends up being Bette Midler. And now for the nominees for Album of the Year. You have Roberta Flack getting nominated for the album Killing Me Softly. Best New Artist winner Bette Midler is nominated for The Divine Miss M. The country artist Charlie Rich is nominated for Behind Closed Doors. You have Paul Simon, now split from Simon & Garfunkel with his album There Goes Rhymin' Simon. And then Stevie Wonder doesn't get an Album of the Year nomination for Talking Book, but he does for Intervisions. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums from 1973 that were not nominated. Now, as always, the Grammys remain completely disconnected from what is, by this point, the most popular genre of music, rock and roll. Do you know what album came out in 1973? Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. This is where sometimes the Grammys just don't make sense to me. When people say they just reward chart success and album sales, okay, then why did they not give any nominations to Dark Side of the Moon? It's one of the best-selling albums of all time. It was a #1 hit in the US. It was still on the Billboard charts when the Grammys were taking place. This is worse than if the Grammys just gave awards to the most popular and the best-selling albums. This means that the premier music awards show that is supposed to recognize the best music completely ignored an album that by any metric you want to use, whether it's charts or sales or critical reviews, is one of the most important albums in history. I'm not even the biggest Pink Floyd fan, but I think if I was in charge of the Grammys and we had failed to give a single nomination to Dark Side of the Moon, I would have burned the whole thing to the ground and started over. Now that's the big one, but there still are some other huge snubs. Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy, you knew they weren't getting anything. David Bowie's Aladdin Sane, I mean, if he didn't get nominated for Ziggy Stardust, he wasn't going to get nominated for this, but what is going on with the Grammys and David Bowie? Marvin Gaye continues to get ignored with his album Let's Get It On. The Stooges album Raw Power, again, it wasn't going to get nominated, but I gotta mention it. You have Bob Marley's breakthrough with the Wailers' Catch a Fire. And then you have The Who's Quadrophenia. The Who, at this point, I mean, there's nothing they can do to get nominated. I don't know how nobody working at the Grammys thought, hey, maybe we should create a category like Best Rock Album. That's an award, by the way, that they don't create until 1995. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to
Stevie Wonder for Inner Visions.
Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions. This was probably a close one for Grammy voters since two of their favorites, Stevie Wonder and Paul Simon, were going against each other, but there's no denying Stevie this year. I wouldn't have minded this winning even if Dark Side of the Moon was nominated. Stevie Wonder is a genius, and this is one of the best albums of his classic period. Billboard magazine actually did a ranking of every Album of the Year winner from the Grammys, and they put this album at #1. So the 17th Annual Grammy Awards, March 1st, 1975. So once again, we've got Andy Williams hosting, and once again, Stevie Wonder has the most nominations of the night. But there are a couple of strange swerves in this year's Grammys. The first thing that's a little unusual about this awards show is that for the first time, the Grammys has some serious competition from other awards shows, something that Andy Williams mentions in his opening monologue. First of all, you had the creation of the American Music Awards, which televised its first awards show in 1974. The American Music Awards, or AMAs, were created by Dick Clark's production company for ABC, specifically to compete with the Grammys, since ABC had lost the Grammys to CBS. Which is kind of ironic now because in 2025, the AMAs are moving to CBS. But although the AMAs are popular and they've now lasted for 50 years, they've never really seriously challenged the Grammys in terms of prestige. One reason might be that unlike the Grammys, the AMAs make no pretense of being about merit. The nominations are based solely on commercial performance, and then the winners are chosen by a public poll. Although it turns out that doing it that way didn't really make that much of a difference. In the inaugural AMAs, the Carpenters won Favorite Pop/Rock Group, Stevie Wonder won Favorite Soul/R&B Male, and Roberta Flack won Favorite Soul/R&B Female. Another new awards show which aired just 2 days after this Grammys was the People's Choice Awards. This was a show that was also on CBS that honored music, but also movies and TV shows. And these awards were determined entirely by Gallup poll results, which it turns out is also not a great way to do it. In the first show in 1975, the winner for favorite male singer was Mac Davis, a country singer who also wrote some of Elvis's big hits like In the Ghetto and A Little Less Conversation. Favorite female singer was a tie between Olivia Newton-John and Lynn Anderson, and favorite group was a tie between the Osmond Brothers and Chicago. So it seems like actually the Grammys are looking really good in comparison to their competition. But before we start patting them on the back too much, let's get to the awards for tonight. Best New Artist is a really weird one. We saw some pretty good nominations. There was Bad Company, Phoebe Snow, Graham Central Station, the new project from Sly and the Family Stone bassist and Drake's uncle Larry Graham. But the winner was Marvin Hamlish. Now, Marvin was mostly known for doing music for movies. He was coming off a big hit with the song The Way We Were, which had been performed by Barbra Streisand for the film of the same name. And he had also done the music for the movie The Sting, in which he used a lot of old Scott Joplin ragtime music. So when he accepted his award for Best New Artist tonight, he actually made a joke about the real Best New Artist being Scott Joplin. Also, an interesting thing about Hamlish is that he would go on to become an EGOT winner, which, if you're not familiar with that, that's somebody who wins an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, which only 21 people have done, which kind of proves the importance of the Grammys. Like, nobody is giving you a special title if you win an Emmy, an Oscar, a Tony, and an American Music Award. And if you want to go even deeper on Marvin Hamlish, he also has a Pulitzer Prize, so some people have referred to him as a PGOT. But okay, let's move on to a new category, although we are not moving away from Marvin Hamlish, because he also won Song of the Year tonight for the song The Way We Were, which beat out Roberta Flack's song Feel Like Making Love and keeps her from three-peating in that category. Marvin Hamlish didn't win Record of the Year, and neither did Roberta Flack, and neither did Elton John for the song Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. No, Record of the Year went to Olivia Newton-John for the song I Honestly Love You. Just a reminder, by the way, since somebody asked me about it, Song of the Year and Record of the Year are both awards that go to individual songs. But Song of the Year is for the songwriter, and Record of the Year is for the performer and the producer. Record of the Year tonight is presented by John Lennon and Paul Simon, but Olivia Newton-John wasn't there to accept, so in one of the highlights of the show, Art Garfunkel ran out to accept on her behalf. And now for the Album of the Year nominees. Paul McCartney and Wings for Band on the Run. Another ex-Beatle gets his first Album of the Year nomination. John Denver gets his first Album of the Year nomination for Back Home Again. Stevie Wonder is nominated for the second year in a row, this time for Fulfillingness's first finale. Elton John is back with the album Caribou. And Joni Mitchell, who had been snubbed for her 1971 album Blue, got a bunch of nominations tonight, including for Album of the Year for the album Court and Spark. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums from 1974 that were not nominated. The big one for me, David Bowie's Diamond Dogs. Now, Bowie actually did make an appearance on this year's show, but only as a presenter. He gave out Best R&B Vocal Performance Female, which went to Aretha Franklin, and he said that getting to give this to Aretha was his personal award. But still, some nominations would have been nice.
Wow, this is so good I could kiss David Bowie!
But other than that, we don't see a lot of albums this year like in previous years that were universally beloved, critically acclaimed classics that didn't get nominated. They're a little more obscure. One album that gets ignored is Steely Dan's Pretzel Logic, which won the NME poll that year for Best Album of 1974. You've got Supertramp's Breakthrough Crime of the Century. You have Genesis's album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. You have Frank Zappa's Apostrophe, Graham Parsons' Grievous Angel, and then you had both the Roxy Music album Country Life and the Brian Eno solo album Here Come the Warm Jets. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to Stevie Wonder. Stevie becomes the first artist since Frank Sinatra to go back-to-back, and what's really great about these Stevie Wonder wins is that this album and last year's winner Innervisions, they really have something to say. In the past, the Grammys have shied away from music with a political message, so it's cool to see them embrace Stevie like this. He also performed at this Grammys doing a rendition of the song You Haven't Done Nothin', which is the most biting political song on the album. It's a protest song directly addressing Richard Nixon, who actually resigned, unrelatedly, 2 days after the song was released. And a fun fact, it featured backup vocals by the Jackson 5, who got their second and last nomination at this year's awards, and Jackson 5 never won a Grammy. But one of them will in a few years. The 18th Annual Grammy Awards, February 28th, 1976. Alright, let's take a minute to talk about Andy Williams. He's back to host again for the 6th time in a row. So what's the deal with this guy? Why was he so good at hosting? I found a couple clips of him hosting online and he seems fine, but I think that maybe his best jokes haven't been preserved on YouTube. According to the book And the Grammy Goes To, he's had some great jokes over the years, some pretty racy ones. In his first hosting gig, he made a joke about John Lennon's dong being out on the cover of the album Two Virgins. And on tonight's awards, he apparently makes a joke about the Grammys turning 18, so they can now be taken across state lines without violating the Mann Act. By the way, did you know that Chuck Berry never won a Grammy? Anyway, Andy Williams also made jokes about Watergate, and tonight he made a joke that they would be opening more envelopes than the CIA, so shout out to Andy Williams. Best New Artist tonight is an interesting one. It goes to Natalie Cole, who also won Best R&B Vocal Performance Female tonight for This Will Be an Everlasting Love. And this is, I'm pretty sure, the first time a child of a previous Grammy winner has won a Grammy themselves. Frank Sinatra's daughter Nancy had been nominated at the 9th and 10th Grammys, but never won. And also, more significantly than that, Natalie Cole is shockingly the first black artist to ever win Best New Artist. But then, in what I hope is just a coincidence, you see in Song and Record of the Year some of the whitest nominations you've ever seen in your life. In Record of the Year, we've got Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell, Mandy by Barry Manilow, The Eagles' Lion Eyes, Janis Ian's At 17, and then the winner, Love Will Keep Us Together by Captain and Tennille. Song of the Year also featured Captain and Tennille, Janis Ian, and Glenn Campbell, but the winner in that category was the Stephen Sondheim song Send in the Clowns, which had been a hit for Judy Collins.
Send in the clowns, don't bother, they're here.
Now here are the nominees for Album of the Year. Linda Ronstadt gets her first nomination for Album of the Year with Heart Like a Wheel. Her old backup band, the Eagles, are nominated for One of These Nights. Janis Ian is nominated for Between the Lines. Paul Simon gets another solo album nomination for Still Crazy After All These Years. And Elton John back yet again with the album Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums from 1975 that were not nominated. We've got a lot of returning faces to the halls of snubbery. Bob Dylan with his masterpiece Blood on the Tracks. It was such a great comeback album for him. Usually the Grammys love a comeback story, but they hate Bob Dylan. Pink Floyd, who managed to follow up Dark Side of the Moon with another classic, Wish You Were Here, no nominations. Led Zeppelin with Physical Graffiti. George Clinton, who never got any nominations for Funkadelic, also doesn't get nominated for Parliament's Mothership Connection. But then we've got a Hall of Fame class of newcomers to the Hall of Snubs. You've got Tom Waits with Nighthawks at the Diner, Patti Smith with Horses, and then Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, one of the best albums of the entire decade, and one that it seems like the Academy would have eaten up, but he gets no nominations. They will make up for that later in his career. And the Grammy goes to Paul Simon, Still Crazy After All These Years. An album that was released October 17th, 1975, which was technically after the Grammys eligibility year had already ended, but still gets nominated. And the biggest song from this album was the single 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, which Paul Simon had actually performed at the Grammy Awards show this night, but it wasn't nominated for anything because it wasn't released as a single until December of 1975. So we will actually see it appear again at next year's awards. Why? Why do you do this, Grammy? Stop doing that. But Paul Simon picks up his second Album of the Year Grammy, his first as a solo artist, and in his speech he thanks a bunch of people, including Art Garfunkel and Stevie Wonder, who he says thank you for not releasing an album in 1975. The 19th Annual Grammy Awards, February 19th, 1977. Well, it's the end of an era. Tonight, Andy Williams hosts the Grammys for the 7th and final time. To this day, he still holds the record for the most times hosted. It's also sort of the end of the Stevie Wonder era. He's going to be nominated and he will win plenty more Grammys in his career, but nothing in the major categories after tonight. And even at this awards, even though he gets the most nominations with 7, he doesn't get any nominations in Song or Record of the Year. The nominees in Record of the Year are If You Leave Me Now by Chicago, I Write the Songs by Barry Manilow, Afternoon Delight by the Starland Vocal Band, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover by Paul Simon, which I mentioned last episode. It's here because it was released as a single in December 1975. But the winner is the song This Masquerade by the jazz singer-guitarist George Benson.
Oh, we're lost in a masquerade.
This Masquerade was also nominated for Song of the Year, along with the Starland Vocal Band's Afternoon Delight, Gordon Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the Neil Sedaka song Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, which this is a weird one. It was already a hit for Neil Sedaka in 1962. In fact, it was nominated at the 5th Grammys for Best Rock and Roll Recording, but Sedaka had re-recorded the song in 1975, and it was a hit again. But it's not the winner for Song of the Year. The winner is I Write the Songs, which was a hit by Barry Manilow, but not written by Barry Manilow. I Write the Songs was written by Bruce Johnston, so he's the one that wins this award.
I write the songs that make the whole world sing.
Now, Starland Vocal Band lost both Song and Record of the Year, but they did win Best New Artist tonight, beating out a band with arguably the greatest debut album of all time, Boston, as well as the funk bands Brothers Johnson, Wild Cherry, and Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band. One fun win tonight is in the category Best Spoken Word Album. It went to the album Great American Documents, which is literally just a recording of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, being read by actors. Henry Fonda, Orson Welles, James Earl Jones, and Helen Hayes. Helen Hayes was a theater actress, and with this win, she becomes the second ever EGOT winner, after the composer Richard Rodgers in 1962. Now here are the nominees for Album of the Year. Stevie Wonder is back with the album Songs in the Key of Life. Boz Scaggs is nominated for the album Silk Degrees, an album that is responsible for the creation of future Grammy winners Toto. Chicago gets another Album of the Year nomination with Chicago X, aka the Chocolate Album, which won for Best Album Package tonight. Peter Frampton is nominated for Frampton Comes Alive.
Frampton Comes Alive. Moment of silence, please.
And George Benson is nominated for his album Breezin'. But as always, before we get to the winner, let's talk about what didn't get nominated from 1976, and let's start off by talking about Queen. Queen's album A Night at the Opera was released in November of 1975, which makes it eligible for this year's awards, and the album gets nominated for nothing. Now, Queen do get their first ever Grammy nominations tonight for the single from A Night at the Opera, Bohemian Rhapsody, which is nominated in Best Pop Vocal Performance by a duo, group, or chorus, which they lose to Chicago's If You Leave Me Now, and Best Arrangement for Voices, where it loses to Afternoon Delight. Bohemian Rhapsody. Arrangement of voices, not as good as in Afternoon Delight. Queen will get 2 more nominations at the 23rd Annual Grammys, but they never win a Grammy in their entire career. Some other big misses, you've got David Bowie's Station to Station, Thin Lizzy's Jailbreak, Rush's 2112, and one that obviously wouldn't get nominated but needs mentioning, the debut album of the Ramones. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to...
The winner is Songs in the Key of Life, Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder, producer.
Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life. Stevie Wonder becomes the second artist ever to get to 3 Album of the Year Grammys, and unlike Frank Sinatra, he didn't even need to rob anybody to get it. This is one of the greatest albums of all time. It's a great triumph for Stevie since he almost quit music altogether before making this record, and it's another excellent choice by the Recording Academy. Patrick Hicks Music Stories presents Every Grammys Ever, the 20th Annual Grammy Awards, February 23rd, 1978. So we've got a new host tonight, no more Andy Williams, John Denver takes over, and we're looking back at the year 1977. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of 1977 in music, I think of one thing, punk rock. You could have a Best New Artist category from punk and punk-adjacent bands alone. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Buzzcocks, Television, Elvis Costello, Talking Heads. What an absolute amazing year. But I know what you're thinking. It's not realistic that any of these bands would have been nominated. This is the Grammys. They're not going to reward anything new or exciting or cutting edge or dangerous. And that's the problem. Even though the 70s have been pretty good and definitely an improvement over the 60s, the Grammys are still safe and boring, even when compared to other awards shows. Look at what we did get for nominees in the Best New Artist category. Sean Cassidy, Andy Gibb, Foreigner, and the winner, Debbie Boone. Now, in her defense, her song You Light Up My Life was huge that year. In fact, it was one of, if not the biggest songs of the entire decade. It stayed at number 1 on the Billboard charts for 10 weeks, which was a record at the time. But come on, Debbie Boone?
And you light up my life. You give me hope.
You Light Up My Life also won Song of the Year, along with, in the first ever tie in the category, Barbra Streisand's evergreen love theme from A Star Is Born. Neither of those songs won in the Record of the Year category. That went to the Eagles' Hotel California.
Man, come on. I had a rough night and I hate the fucking Eagles, man.
Welcome to the Hotel California. Such a lovely place, such a lovely place, such a lovely face.
Now, the Album of the Year category was much more interesting, with some legit all-timers on it. You had Steely Dan getting their first Album of the Year nomination with Asia, Fleetwood Mac with Rumors, the Eagles with Hotel California, the Star Wars soundtrack by John Williams, and the James Taylor album JT. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about what else came out in 1977 that wasn't nominated. In addition to all of the amazing punk records I mentioned, there was also David Bowie's Heroes and Low. 2 masterpieces, 1 year. And still to this point, David Bowie has never been nominated for a Grammy. And wait till you see what he finally does get nominated for. It's an even bigger insult. You also had Exodus by Bob Marley, Iggy Pop's Lust for Life, Kraftwerk's hugely influential Trans-Europe Express, and, strangely, given that he will have success later on, Billy Joel's The Stranger. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to...
Fleetwood Mac!
Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. Okay, Grammys, I just can't stay mad at you this decade. Even though personally I care more about what was happening at CBGB's in 1977 than I do what was happening in Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks' bedroom, it's Rumors. I'm not going to be mad about Rumors being picked as Album of the Year. I've said before that one of the reasons I think awards shows are important are as a time capsule, so people in the future can look back and see what music people consider to be important at the time. And if I'm thinking of the music of the 70s, Rumors is going to be one of the first albums that comes to mind, so this is a great choice. God Save the Queen, Stevie Nicks. The 21st Annual Grammy Awards, February 15th, 1979. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the world of music. You still have punk rock, you're kind of already into post-punk, you've got new wave happening, the beginnings of hip-hop, and of course, disco. And more than any of those other genres, disco is making its mark on the Grammy Awards. You could see that right off the bat in the Best New Artist category, where the group A Taste of Honey, who had had a huge hit with Boogie Oogie Oogie in 1978, takes home the prize. And I think they are the first Grammy-winning group named after a Grammy-winning song. The Best New Artist category was actually pretty exciting this year. You had Elvis Costello nominated, The Cars, and Toto. You also see some disco in the other big categories, as Stayin' Alive by the Bee Gees from the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack is nominated for both Song and Record of the Year, along with songs like You Don't Bring Me Flowers, Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty, and 3 Times a Lady by the Commodores. But the winner in both categories is Billy Joel's Just the Way You Are. And Billy Joel had never been nominated for a Grammy before, so these were his first 2 nominations, and he won both. This is a song from his 1977 album The Stranger, which didn't get nominated for anything as an album because it came out in September of 1977, so it was in the eligibility period of last year's awards, but Just the Way You Are was released as a single in November, so it was just over the line to be eligible for this year's awards.
I'll take you just the way you are.
Now, nothing against the song Just the Way You Are, but it's kind of typical Grammys that you don't see something like Only the Good Die Young nominated. Instead, of course, it's the ballad from the album. If you just look at the last 5 years of Song of the Year winners, you've got The Way We Were, Send in the Clowns, I Write the Songs, Evergreen, You Light Up My Life, Just the Way You Are. Every single one is a schlocky ballad. I don't hate these songs, but this category has become pretty stale and predictable. Some other things that were a little more interesting this year, David Bowie finally gets his first ever Grammy nomination. And it is, of course, in the category Best Recording for Children. This year he recorded the album Peter and the Wolf. And he didn't even win, although you can't really be mad at who did win. It was Jim Henson for The Muppet Show. And then the Album of the Year nominees were pretty interesting too. The nominees were The Rolling Stones' Some Girls. Yep, in the same year that David Bowie gets his first nomination, the Rolling Stones finally get a nomination. This is the only thing they're nominated for all night, and it's for Album of the Year, and it's for Some Girls, which is a great album. It's no Exile on Main Street or Sticky Fingers or Let It Bleed, but it's a good album. It also has at least one song that was inspired by the new punk rock movement, so if you want to count this as the first punk-inspired album to be nominated for Album of the Year, you could. We also saw Jackson Browne's Running on Empty, We saw a couple of soundtracks, both the Grease soundtrack and the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Big year for John Travolta. And then you have the album Even Now by Barry Manilow. Whew, but now let's talk about what else came out in 1978. You had Elvis Costello's This Year's Model. He did get a nomination for Best New Artist, but nothing else. Parallel Lines by Blondie. Kate Bush's The Kick Inside. She didn't even get any nominations for Wuthering Heights. Devo's Are We Not Men. X-Ray Spex, Germ-Free Adolescence. And the first album from Van Halen. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to...
And the winner is Saturday Night Fever!
The Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. I'm okay with it. This was a cultural moment, disco was huge, Stayin' Alive is still a song that endures. It has the kind of fun distinction of being the win where the most Grammys were given out in a single category, because they had to give one to everybody who was an artist and producer on the album, which was a soundtrack. So the Bee Gees got Grammys, Casey and the Sunshine Band, Kool and the Gang, the Tramps, and then a ton of producers. It was 50 people in all that got Grammys. So even though personally I would have loved to see the Rolling Stones win with their first nomination, I'm not mad at this. At least it wasn't Barry Manilow. The 22nd Annual Grammy Awards, February 27th, 1980. In the immortal words of the Ramones, who were never nominated for a single Grammy, although they did get a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2011, it's the end. The end of the 70s. It's the end of the century. We are at the end of the 1970s. We're 1/3 of the way through this series. We get a new host this year. It's Kenny Rogers. He also won the most Grammys in this awards with 5, which seems kind of like a conflict of interest, but okay. And in his monologue, Kenny Rogers talked about the importance of the Grammys. He talked about how the awards were moving into their second decade of being on television, and he said that the Grammy is finally established in the minds of everyone as the most meaningful and highly desired award. And as much criticism as people have for the Grammys, I think that is true. If somebody wins a Grammy, it is automatically added to the first line of their biography. Grammy-winning singer, Grammy-winning songwriter. It will be in their obituary. As much as people say that they don't matter, people do put an importance on these awards, which is why I think it's important to study their history. Speaking of history, we've got some historic firsts tonight. For one thing, we finally see Bob Dylan win a solo Grammy. He had gotten one for being part of the concert for Bangladesh, but tonight he finally wins one on his own. Although it's kind of an odd one, he wins Best Rock Vocal Performance Male for the song Gotta Serve Somebody. It's kind of funny that it wasn't until 1980 that they thought maybe rock music needed some specific genre categories. So they added Best Rock Vocal Performance Female, Best Rock Vocal Performance Male, Best Rock Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group, and Best Rock Instrumental Performance, which they somehow decided was a vital category to have in 1980. The female award went to a singer that we all associate with rock music, Donna Summer, who beat the jazz pop singer Rickie Lee Jones, the blues singer Bonnie Raitt, the folk singer Carly Simon, and the country singer Tanya Tucker. The Best Rock Group Award went to the Eagles, and the Instrumental Award went to a song by Wings, who beat out my personal favorite nominee, Frank Zappa, for his song Rat Tamago. This instrumental rock category inexplicably lasted until 2011. Bob Dylan beat out Joe Jackson, Robert Palmer, Rod Stewart, and Frank Zappa. This was from his Christian album Slow Train Coming. Slow Train Coming was Bob Dylan's 19th studio album, but this night also saw the first win for an artist who had just released his first solo album, Michael Jackson. He won Best R&B Vocal Performance Male for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. That song was also nominated for Best Disco Recording, but lost to Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. This was the first and only time that this category was awarded. They discontinued this the next year, but still, disco got its own award and not punk. Now, Best New Artist this year is pretty fascinating. You have multiple comedians nominated. It had been a long time since a non-musician was nominated for Best New Artist, but you had both the Blues Brothers, who I guess are kind of musicians, and Robin Williams nominated. There was also The Knack and Dire Straits, but the winner was Rickie Lee Jones. Now you can see with the addition of the disco and rock vocal categories, they're mixing things up this year. And for some reason this year, for Song of the Year, they expanded beyond 5 songs. There are 8 songs nominated for Song of the Year, including songs by Rickie Lee Jones, I Will Survive, plus songs from Billy Joel, Earth, Wind & Fire, Peaches and Herb, and the host Kenny Rogers, and 2 songs from the Doobie Brothers. And the winner ends up being the Doobie Brothers song, What a Fool Believes. What a Fool Believes also wins Record of the Year, which was only 5 songs this year. They beat out After the Love Has Gone by Earth, Wind & Fire, The Gambler by Kenny Rogers, I Will Survive, and You Don't Bring Me Flowers by Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond. And wait a minute, wasn't You Don't Bring Me Flowers also nominated last year for Song of the Year? Now, how did that happen? Because there were actually 2 different versions of the song. Neil Diamond recorded one, and Barbra Streisand recorded one. So that underlying song is what was nominated for Song of the Year, but then a DJ in Louisville, Kentucky named Gary Guthrie took those 2 solo recordings, one from Barbra Streisand, one for Neil Diamond, and he spliced them together. It's actually supposed to be a present to his wife, who he was divorcing. It was a goodbye present. And he aired his spliced together duet on the radio, and it became a huge hit. So at this year's Grammys, You Don't Bring Me Flowers, now credited to Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond, is nominated for Record of the Year, and they perform it as a duet on the show. Now here are the nominations for Album of the Year. First up, Billy Joel, who couldn't be nominated for The Stranger last year because it was outside the eligibility year, does get nominated for his album 52nd Street. We see disco represented again with Donna Summer's Bad Girls. We see the host, Kenny Rogers, get a nomination for The Gambler. You see Song and Record of the Year winners, the Doobie Brothers, nominated for their album Minute by Minute. Great year for yacht rock. And then you have the enormously successful record by Supertramp, Breakfast in America. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about what wasn't nominated. We've got some big ones. Michael Jackson's Off the Wall. He did get those nominations and his first win for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, but nothing for the album. You've got Talking Heads, Fear of Music, Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures, and AC/DC's Highway to Hell, which if it were up to me, all of the previous AC/DC albums would have been nominated, but this is the first one that actually sold in America, and it was ignored. And the Grammy goes to Billy Joel, 52nd Street. Billy Joel has had a great 2 years at the Grammys. He's racked up a Song of the Year, a Record of the Year, and an Album of the Year. And now that we're at the end of the 1970s, let's look back at the decade like we did with the 60s and see if the Grammys has done any better. We've got Bridge Over Troubled Water, Tapestry, The Concert for Bangladesh, Inner Visions, Fulfilling This' First Finale, Still Crazy After All These Years, Songs in the Key of Life, Rumors, Saturday Night Fever, and 52nd Street. And I gotta say, that is a huge improvement over the albums from the 60s. These are some of the most iconic albums of the 70s. I might have had a few nitpicks here and there of who should have won, but this is pretty representative of the decade. You've got soul, funk, pop, rock, singer-songwriter, disco. I think the Grammys are in a pretty good place. Let's see if they can keep going into the 1980s. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time for the highs and lows of the 23rd Grammy Awards in 1981.
Because you had to be a big shot.